Hey everybody, this is Unit 12, the Respiratory System. We are going to talk about your lungs, how you breathe, and some of the other functions of the respiratory system, including getting air in and out, which is ventilation, and exchanging gases, which is respiration. We're going to talk about respiratory diseases and the purpose of spirometry. We'll talk about the way the blood carries oxygen and carbon dioxide as well. So, moving air in and out of the body is called ventilation, and exchanging oxygen and CO2 between the alveoli and the blood is respiration. And pretty much the respiratory system, all diseases can be divided into a problem with ventilation or a problem with respiration. The respiratory system also does a few other things, including make sound. Okay, speech is done through the larynx, the voice box, which is part of the respiratory system. Your sense of smell, because your nose is considered part of the respiratory system. Breathing makes your lung cavity expand and contract, and small clots, when they get to the lungs, because of that expansion and contraction, it helps break them up. Not big ones, but small ones can do that. That's one of the reasons that a nurse or medical assistant will get you up in the middle of the night after surgery and make you take deep breaths. Not something you're really happy about doing in the middle of the night, but the idea is break up small clots. And it also helps balance pH. To get rid of acid, one of the responses is to breathe faster, because when you breathe out, you get rid of acid. Okay, so here's a generalized picture of the respiratory system and the anatomy. Make sure you check out your master list or the lab about the respiratory system to know which parts you need to know. But basically, air should go in through your nose, down the back of your throat, which is called your pharynx, through the voice box, the larynx, into the trachea. And that divides into the primary bronchi, one to each lung, branches further into smaller and smaller bronchi, eventually the bronchioles, to the alveoli, which are the air sacs, and that's where gas exchange takes place. Your upper respiratory tract is basically your nose down to your voice box. And you can breathe through your mouth, but it's thought that it's better to do it through your nose because the air gets humidified, cleaned, and warmed up better in your nose. And that improves gas exchange. But if your nose is plugged, you can still breathe through your mouth. The back of the nasal cavity there is the nasopharynx. The back of the throat behind the mouth is the oropharynx. And the part that goes down to the voice box is the laryngopharynx. Air travels through all of them. You just have to know the word pharynx is your throat. But you should also know that the oropharynx also will sometimes contain food. So it's kind of used in both systems. The larynx is your voice box, and it's right here. You can see the vocal cords right there underneath that line that's labeled glottis. That's the space between your vocal cords. And this flap right here, the epiglottis, actually covers the trachea when you swallow. Okay, the uvula, this part right here, the soft palate, goes up or back to plug up the nasopharynx so food doesn't go up your nose. So when you swallow, the uvula moves up and protects your nose, and the epiglottis moves down and protects your trachea from food or liquid going either of those directions. You want food or liquid to go down the esophagus. Notice it is posterior to the trachea. So your trachea is in front of the esophagus. So that's the upper respiratory tract. The lower respiratory tract, from the voice box down, includes the trachea. Okay, and again, that epiglottis covers that up when you're swallowing. But then air moves down the trachea, which is lined with, or stays open because of the rings of hyaline cartilage. And it's lined with epithelial tissue, just like any other tube. Okay, and those epithelial cells have cilia, and mucus is secreted to try to catch any of the dust or junk that you might be breathing in. When you get down to the bottom of the trachea, it divides into the primary bronchi, one bronchi for each lung. That further divides into the secondary bronchi, and your right lung is bigger than your left, so you have 3 lobes, so you have 3 secondary bronchi. Your left lung is a little smaller because your heart is more on the left side, so it has 2 secondary bronchi, one for each lobe there. They further branch and branch and branch into the tertiary, quaternary, and eventually bronchioles, and that eventually leads to the alveoli, which I'll show you in just a second here. Here's a picture of the lungs, and it shows the different lobes there, 1, 2, and 3 on the right, and just 2 on the left side, because you can see the heart kind of fits between there. You should remember that the lungs are covered with a membrane, and it would be referred to as the visceral pleura, because that touches the organs itself, and the cavity that the lungs are in are lined with the parietal pleura. Remember, parietal lines a cavity. And so the lungs are slippery, just like your gut organs are, because these membranes secrete serous fluid. And when the lungs expand and contract, when you breathe in and out, that reduces friction to 0 so they don't rub each other or get raw. Okay, again, 3 lobes on the right, 2 on the left. Anyway, the bronchial tree eventually branches down to the alveolar ducts, leading to these little air sacs, which looks like a bunch of grapes. Okay, and the air sacs are called the alveoli or alveolar sacs. They should only be filled with air, right? Because you want gas exchange to occur, or that's where it occurs, because every one of those alveoli are wrapped around by capillaries. So the blood coming from the heart is able to take in oxygen and get rid of carbon dioxide when it gets down to these alveolar capillaries. Okay, and then the blood leaving the lungs is chock full of oxygen, and it has gotten rid of a bunch of its CO2. If the alveolar sacs fill with liquid, we call that drowning. Pneumonia causes the alveoli to fill up full of fluid, and that would inhibit respiration. Okay, if you laid out all your alveoli, flattened them all out, the surface area would cover half a tennis court, which is kind of cool. Okay, so the lining of the respiratory tubes, of course, are lined with epithelial cells, and the trachea is lined with pseudostratified ciliated columnar. You can see the cilia here. And again, that functions to catch the debris and the dust and anything else you breathe in. It also, there's goblet cells secreting mucus to try to catch stuff. And that's great defense against against all the stuff that's in the air, viruses and bacteria. When you get down to the bronchial tubes, they're simple cuboidal, and the alveoli are simple squamous. And there's no mucus or cilia once you get that low. If it hasn't caught it by then, you have to hope the white blood cells hanging around will eat it up. Smoking destroys that cilia, but cilia will grow back. So after 3 hours of not smoking, your cilia will start to grow. So you should quit smoking every 3 hours. All right. Again, respiration is exchange of gases, the oxygen and CO2. It happens at the alveoli. Do not confuse this with cellular respiration. That's the metabolism of glucose to generate ATP. Here we're talking about gas exchange respiration. It's just air respiration at this point. Ventilation is movement of air in and out of the lungs. And if you were choking, for example, that would prevent ventilation. Okay, COPD, asthma, allergies sometimes inhibit ventilation because your tubes get plugged up or clogged with mucus or inflamed or they're constricted or whatever. All respiratory problems are divided kind of into either a respiration problem or a ventilation problem. Ventilation we can measure, and I will talk about that here, and you're going to do that in lab. All right, so how do you breathe in and out? Basically, air goes from high to low pressure. So if you want air to go in, the pressure inside your lungs has to be lower than the pressure in the atmosphere outside. And the way that we can change pressure is we change volume. Volume and pressure are opposite. So when the lung cavity gets bigger, the pressure goes down inside of it. Okay, so you think of a balloon or think of a box, and if you put air in there and then you try to make the box smaller, the pressure is going to go up because you're trying to push that air into a smaller space. If you let the box expand, the pressure goes down because now the air can spread out. So if you want the pressure in your chest cavity to be lower than atmospheric pressure, you got to make it bigger. So think about when you take a deep breath. Take a deep breath right now. Your chest moves up and out, and your diaphragm moves down when it contracts. That makes the cavity bigger, the pressure goes down, and air gets sucked in. Okay, so inhalation or inspiration, the pressure inside needs to be lower so the air can move in. Therefore, the cavity gets bigger. The diaphragm moves down, it contracts, and the ribs move up and out. You can see that little animation happen there. To make air go out or to exhale, the opposite has to happen. Air goes from high to low pressure, so you need to make the pressure inside higher, and to do that you make the volume smaller. Okay, so the cavity gets smaller. The diaphragm relaxes and moves up, and the ribs and rib cage moves down and in. Cavity gets smaller, pressure is higher, air goes out. So taking air in is actually an active process. You have to contract your diaphragm. Letting air out is you need to relax. It's a passive process. So when you have a panic attack and you feel like you can't breathe, you can take air in, but you can't relax enough to let air out. And pretty soon you run out of oxygen in the lungs because you're not letting air out. That means new air can't get in. And it does feel like you can't breathe. It doesn't feel like you have enough oxygen. And of course, people around you are like, just relax. They're right, but you ought to slap the crap out of them, because if you could relax, you wouldn't be having a panic attack, right? So you got to do something to think about something else so that you're able to relax, and your pons and medulla oblongata, your brainstem, will kick in and help you restore normal breathing. This is a side view. When you contract your diaphragm, it pulls it down. Notice the cavity got bigger. When you relax your diaphragm, the cavity got smaller. When the cavity gets bigger, pressure goes down, so air comes in. When the cavity got smaller, pressure goes up, so air goes out. Now you can measure this, like I said a few minutes ago, with a machine called a spirometer. A respiratory cycle is normal air in and out, and generally people do that 12 to 20 times per minute, and the normal breath in and out is referred to as your tidal volume. It's about 500 milliliters, so like a bottle of water, is about how much goes in a normal breath. But vital capacity is generally what a respiratory therapist wants to measure, and it's the amount of air that you can forcibly exchange. So in other words, you take a deepest breath as possible and push everything out you can. That's your vital capacity. And we're going to do that in lab, which is kind of cool. And it depends on, your vital capacity depends on your age, your sex, and your height. If you are a young, male, tall person, a young, tall male, you have much higher vital capacity than short, old women. Okay, so men have higher vital capacity, younger people have higher vital capacity, and taller people because their chest cavity is bigger. Other things can affect this, but you can't change those three things. If you are in good shape, you tend to have a better vital capacity, a little higher. Deep sea divers and swimmers and opera singers, those people who practice taking deep breaths, will often have a higher vital capacity. But your vital capacity does not change when you go to sleep. Your breathing rate might go down, but your age, sex, and height has not changed just because you're sleeping in bed. Okay? All right, there's always some air left in your lung. That's called the residual volume. Okay, you can't get rid of all of it because otherwise your lungs would collapse, right? Everything doesn't fall in on itself when you breathe out. So there's some air always there, making your total lung capacity on average about 6 liters. Okay, which seems like a lot, 3 2-liter bottles, but that's average. Obviously, if you're smaller or older, it's going to be lower than that. So here's some respiratory volumes, a little graph that shows you tidal volume there in the middle, that's the normal in and out, and your vital capacity, the amount you can forcibly exchange. Residual volume, you're never going to get that total out. Okay, so vital capacity is measured to determine your lung capacity. So for example, if you had asthma or chronic bronchitis, a doctor might measure your vital capacity and then prescribe you medication if it's low, and then after a week or two on the medication, check it again, and so he or she can determine whether the medication worked. Okay. Again, average is based on height, age, and gender, and estimations of this can be checked. You can check it online or on a table. It's in your lab manual, but we'll measure this in lab, which is kind of fun to do. Can you think of a reason that your vital capacity might be higher or lower than average? Okay. People who are obese or not very active or smoke might have a lower vital capacity, for example. All right, so how to control your breathing. You cannot hold your breath and die. Okay, you can't hold it long enough. You can hold your breath long enough to pass out. At that point, your brainstem, medulla oblongata and pons, will kick in and trigger normal breathing. Okay, it will also, if you are in acidosis or low oxygen levels, will make you breathe faster. Okay, so if you go up on a high altitude mountain where the oxygen concentration is lower, that could trigger an increase in your breathing rate. Okay, remember you can't really control your brainstem. That is just autonomic nervous system stuff. Certainly you can hold your breath or purposely, try to breathe slower or faster up to a point, but again, you can't do it forever. Your brainstem will kick in and restore normal breathing. So you have a little kid that says, I'm going to hold my breath till I die, or have a temper tantrum. Yep, just put pillows around him, because when he falls or when he passes out, normal breathing will be restored. All right, gas exchange is respiration. Remember, there's no mucus around the alveoli because they're air sacs. You only want air in there. Gas exchange occurs by simple diffusion. There's no transporters. It's very passive. It goes from high to low concentration. Oxygen is going to be higher in your air sacs than in your blood because the blood is coming from your tissues and your tissues have used up the oxygen. Hopefully that breath of air you just sucked in has high oxygen in it. Okay, that's the point of breathing, right? CO2 is the opposite. Carbon dioxide is high in the blood in your lungs because it's coming from the tissues that just made it all. And there's low CO2 in the air that you just sucked in, so diffusion is out. Everybody knows you take oxygen in and CO2 is exhaled or leaves until you start talking about the respiratory system, and then your brain gets all confused. So think about it in the obvious, common sense sort of way. Oxygen goes in because it's higher concentration in the air that you breathe in than it is in your blood, and CO2 goes out because it's higher in your blood compared to the air that you just breathed in. Okay. If the alveoli fill up with water, what do you suppose happens to respiration? It slows down. That's drowning. Okay, so smoking might inhibit ventilation, but drowning or swallowing water or pneumonia inhibits respiration. Here's a little picture of gas exchange. Oxygen is going into the blood and CO2 is leaving. Okay? Remember, gas exchange cannot occur until the air gets all the way to the alveoli. It can't happen in the trachea, the bronchi, the secondary bronchi, the bronchioles, nothing. It's got to get all the way to the alveoli because the walls are too thick on all those other tubes for gas exchange to happen. Okay? You literally have one layer of cells around the alveoli and then one layer of cells around the capillary. And the oxygen and the CO2 diffuse through those two cells to the blood or to the air sac, depending on whether you're oxygen or CO2. Okie dokie. The last thing I'm going to talk about is oxygen and CO2 and how it's carried in the blood. CO2 leaves the tissues, okay, and is in the blood and is carried to the lungs. Oxygen is carried to the tissues from the lungs. Okay, and mostly oxygen is carried by hemoglobin, by the red blood cells. But carbon dioxide is carried a bunch of different ways. Okay, so oxygen is the easy one. It's carried by hemoglobin. Okay, so oxygen diffuses into the red blood cells and it binds all these little molecules of hemoglobin. And then when it gets to the tissues, it's dropped off and goes into the cells and you use it for cellular respiration. Carbon dioxide can be carried 3 different ways. First of all, it can just be a bubble of gas in your plasma. So it's produced in the tissue cells and it just hangs out in the plasma. It can be carried by hemoglobin, just like oxygen being carried by hemoglobin to the tissues. It can pick up hemoglobin and carry it back to the lungs. It seems kind of silly that if hemoglobin is a bus, you might as well haul the oxygen one way and carbon dioxide the other. But 70% of carbon dioxide reacts with water inside a red blood cell and is converted to carbonic acid, which dissociates into bicarbonate and a hydrogen ion. What you need to remember is that essentially it's carried via the bicarbonate pathway. 70% of carbon dioxide is carried this way. And the benefit of that is bicarbonate can go out into the blood and act as a buffer to help balance pH. So even though the function is to take oxygen and carbon dioxide back and forth between tissues in the lungs, the side benefit of the way we do it is that your blood has this buffer in it to help prevent wild changes in pH. Remember, blood pH needs to be 7.4, and even a little bit of change causes our proteins to denature, and that would be very dangerous for us. Okay, pulmonary diseases include asthma, chronic bronchitis, and pneumonia, and emphysema. You might have heard of some of these. Asthma and bronchitis are both ventilation problems. The tubes just get clogged up either with mucus or inflammation. We have medications to treat these, of course, but they're not necessarily curable. Chronic bronchitis is usually brought on by exposure to pollution or smoking or another lifelong exposure type thing. And while we can treat it, often it's just chronic. It's just there for the person. Pneumonia is caused by a variety of different things, from fungus to bacteria to viruses, and it affects respiration. Emphysema is a destruction of the alveoli, and once you lose alveoli, air sacs, you don't get them back. Smoking is the #1 reason for emphysema, but exposure to other pollutants can also cause this. Okay. Again, which are ventilation and which are respiration problems. Pneumonia and emphysema are respiration, and asthma and chronic bronchitis are ventilation problems. Sometimes they're grouped together as COPD, chronic obstructive pulmonary diseases, but no matter what you call them, the whole purpose or the way to treat them is to try to improve ventilation by various medications, etc. Alright, so that is the end of Unit 12. Check out your lab manual as well as the reading assignment. And as always, feel free to ask questions via email.